I'd like to welcome you all to The Passage, and thank you so much for coming out tonight and supporting your local independent bookstore, first of all. Isabel Allende recently was quoted as calling The Passage the cultural soul of our community. And it's really true. It's really a special thing that we get to come together and talk about really important and interesting things and have a dialogue. So thank you for making that all possible. Tonight we are very proud to welcome Anne Marie Slaughter, first female director of policy planning at the U.S. State Department, president and CEO of New America, professor, and author. She is also a visionary in her ability to confront feminist ideals that may have become antiquated. Her article, which appeared in The Atlantic, Why Women Still Can't Have It All, was a reply to her many critics disappointed in her decision to step down from her landmark position, pursuing instead a career in academics, which left more time for her family. The article hit a national nerve and created a national conversation. Anne Marie has continued and elaborated on that conversation in her book, Unfinished Business: Women, Men, Work, Family. This book clarifies Anne Marie's thoughts on work-life balance and offers insight and inspiration. Atul Gawande writes, Unfinished Business insists we recognize a simple truth. Human life requires space for caring for others during childhood, illness, infirmity, and everything in between. Anne Marie Slaughter has written the instruction manual for our next cultural revolution. So with that, let's warmly welcome
Nothing like raising your expectations. So I'm glad to be here, and I have to say, I feel relaxed and happy in a bookstore. I worked in an independent bookstore in high school in Charlottesville, Virginia for 4 years, and there really is sort of nowhere I'd rather be. And after I talk to you, I'm going to buy some books. So the first thing to say about this book is that 3 years ago, when I did write my Atlantic article, and it did create a firestorm that nobody, certainly not me, expected, 3 years ago, I could not have written this book. I really couldn't have. I have spent the last 3 years, first of all, reading the hundreds of comments and emails that people sent to me, and I guess because I had been fairly candid in that article, people were very open with me. I mean, I got long letters and emails telling me their life stories, all the commentary online. And then I gave speeches around the country, which was a little ironic because I left the State Department to go home to be with my children, and now I was giving speeches about going home to be with my children. A irony that was not lost on my children. But talking to people, answering questions, putting different thoughts out there, reading, thinking. And I've come out in a very different place than I was 3 years ago, or that I think I ever expected to be. So that's the first thing, is this is not an extension of the article. This is a different frame. And I talked to lots of people. I also talked to my own family members. It was interesting that writing the article brought out things that I didn't know even about my own family. And one of my friends wrote me and said that my father always thought I should have a career. This is Virginia in the 1960s. And that her father didn't think she should have a career. And why was my father so progressive? Which had frankly never occurred to me. It was my dad. He wanted me to have a career. That seemed normal. So I wrote him and I said, Dad, why did you want that? And he told me something I had never realized, which is that he was a lawyer, and he was representing a number of women whose husbands had left them in the 60s. They had put their husbands through school, they had raised the children, and their husbands were gone, and they had no means of supporting themselves. And so he said, I vowed then that my daughter would always be able to support herself. And I tell that story because he's my dad and I love him, but I'd never seen that fathering side of him, that as a father, really being determined that I have a career so that I'd never be in this position. And looking at my mother also, who was a professional artist, and I would have always told you that, but she was also a homemaker, and I wouldn't have told you that. And now they're both in their 80s, and I look at them and I look at their life's work, And it seems to me that their life's work is really equal. My mother raised an extraordinary family and created a network of love and support that is the foundation for everything I do and my brothers do. And I've come to see the relative importance of that work, not one better than the other, but equal. And the last thing that changed is as I traveled around the country and then took over New America, my husband became the unquestioned lead parent of our sons. He had been when I was in Washington because I was commuting for 2 years and he was the only one home. But we were both home, but he was the one that, as they headed through high school, who did that lovely work of getting your teenagers to do their homework, to practice their music, to do pretty much everything they have to do. And we talked about that a lot, what it was for him to be the lead parent and how he experienced that. And it got me thinking also about sort of his and my interactions and shaped the book. So the first thing to say is really how to think about this problem, or the problem that I was addressing. And the problem I was addressing in 2012 was, why are there not enough women at the top? 50 years after we had the second wave of the women's movement, and we have women outpacing men in high school, in college, in graduate school. I know this, I took my teenage son on his college tour, and I was basically told that he could have lower grades and scores than if I had a daughter, because the girls are doing better than the boys, and you have to keep it roughly equal. So you've got women really doing fabulously, and they're outpacing men when they go into the workforce. But then, of course, as they rise, you're looking at maybe 20% in a good industry of senior women, and that's a good industry. You're looking at 5% in finance or many other industries, and in tech. I was just at Yahoo earlier today. And that's the way I frame the issue. It's the way Sheryl Sandberg's framed the issue. It's the way lots of people have framed the issue. I now think we need to be asking not only why there are not enough women at the top, but why there are too many women at the bottom. And I think you have to look at that whole picture, because there are far too many women at the bottom. The majority of minimum wage workers are women. 2/3 of shift workers are women. And the poorest members of our society are overwhelmingly single mothers. 40% of women are their family's primary breadwinner. A large percentage of that number are single moms, and they are the caregivers and the breadwinners both. So the first thing to say is we have to look at that whole picture, not just why we don't have enough women CEOs, but why we have far too many women who are below the poverty line. And I think when you ask the question that way, you come out with a different set of answers, which I'll come to. But it's important to insist on that because we're so inclined to count. Right? That's how we measure progress. We count how many women are in the Fortune 500. And that immediately focuses us at the top echelons. We need to look at everybody. Another thing that as I sort of work my way through this, and I will just say up front, because I'm in California, it's always the first question I get, how do I think about lean in? How do I, I guess.
How about that?
How about that? And so the first, I talk about this in the book. I think Sheryl Sandberg has done extraordinary work. As a boss, I've had women come to me and ask for raises because they've read Lean In, which actually puts me in a very awkward position because as a feminist, I want to support them, and as a boss, you have to think about, do they deserve the raise? But she's done great work. The way it's just not enough. It's a big piece of a larger puzzle, but you can't lean in without a support system, right? It's elementary physics. You lean in, and unless you have a counterbalance, you will tip over. And in my case, I hit a tipping point even with a great support system. I had a husband at home who was the lead parent, and yet, I had a child who really needed both hands on deck. And obviously, life happens in ways we don't expect. And, whether you have a child with special needs or a divorce or whatever it might be, you need that support system, and even there, you have to allow for the periods in your life where you're not going to be able to lean in. So that's a sort of another thing that I worked my way through. And then I started thinking about what I talked about in the article as half-truths, things that are true but not wholly true. And I originally started with precisely this idea that you can put together your family and your career if you just work hard enough, if you're just committed enough to your career. That's the lean-in point, and as I just said, sometimes, not always. Or if you sequence it right, if you marry the right person. But then I started thinking about those half-truths with respect to men. So, because large part of this story is really about men. So think about what we say about men. We say a man's job is to provide, right? And it's actually biblical. It's also in the Quran, as I discovered in researching this. This sort of strong idea that men are definitely raised with, a man's job is to provide. Well, it is, but a woman's job is to provide too, right? 60% of American women are in the workforce, over 70% mothers. I'm a provider, my husband's a provider, and frankly, the idea that you provide only cash doesn't make sense. If you're providing care, you are providing in the same way. But, we say that it's a sort of one of those cliches that actually, I think, shapes us in many ways. And we say things like, a child needs her mother, or a child needs its mother. Grammatically, a child needs his or her mother, the professor and me. And I have a taxi driver who drives me back and forth to Trenton, and he would say this periodically to me. And for him, it was a compliment. He was talking about his own mother and how important it was, and a child needs its mother. And yes, a child does need his or her mother, but I don't think a child needs his or her mother any more than a child needs his or her father. I really think children need people who love them and who are, strong and dependable and predictable in their life. And frankly, the more the better. So if you have grandparents, or in our family, many of my former students have become very close to us. They are, members of an extended or constructed family. But that image that says a child needs his or her mother is again something that really reinforces an idea about whose responsibility it is to raise children. And the last one I'll go through here before sort of talking about the thesis of the book is in the workplace, and I've argued this too, we argue that flexibility is the solution, right? That if we could just have the flexibility that I had as an academic, that writers have, that the people who can schedule their own time have, they can make it work. And I do think that workplaces need much more deep flexibility, and I'm a CEO now, we're trying to do that within New America. But that is only part of the problem, because the deeper problem is flexibility stigma, right? Where you take flexibility, where you take part-time work, or you work from home one day a week, or whatever your workplace allows you to do, you can be flexible, but you are stigmatized. You are no longer on leadership track. And that is actually a deeper problem for the many women and a growing number of men who are trying to make it fit together. Yes, they can keep working, but they're not going to rise, right? And we should think about that as stigma and fight it the way we fight any other stigma. You haven't lost any IQ points because you work part-time, right? You aren't less educated, you're not less experienced, you're simply working differently, and when you're ready to work hard again, you should be treated like anybody else. So those are some of the sort of factors and that I sort of worked my way through and thought about, how do we reframe this debate so that we can actually get beyond where we've been stuck for the last 20 years. And my answer is that it's not a women's problem, that it is a work problem, that it is a couple's problem, and that it is very definitely a national problem. So on the work issue, let's start there. We have a workplace that is still the 1950s. I mean, it's really all the presumptions. It's like Leave It to Beaver, right? June Cleaver's at home when the kids come home at 3 o'clock, or when there's a snow day, or when there's no school, or when the kid is sick, or whatever happens. And I'm talking about children, but it's equally true for elder care, right? I mean, I'm the height of the baby boom, so as I age, the baby boom becomes an elder boom. I mean, it's equally important as we take care of our parents. Our workplace assumes someone's at home, but no one's at home in the majority of American homes. And families don't look like 1950s families either. So this is a problem of the workplace not accommodating the workforce of the 21st century. And that's the way it should be approached. Not as, I'm a working mother and you need to make accommodation for me, but you've got a workplace of people who also have caregiving obligations and you have to make room for care. And if you don't make room for care, you are hemorrhaging talent. You are losing all the people, the women that you trained, that you invested in, and again, increasingly men. You are, frankly, losing the workers who benefit from caregiving. Part of the book talks about the ways in which caregiving allows us to grow. I'm a far better manager and leader because I'm a mother. I may not be, I don't know if I'm a better mother because I'm a manager and a leader, but I'm very certain of the other. And a large part of the central chapter really explores the ways that being a caregiver means investing in others, right? Being a competitor means investing in yourself. And investing in others is really about giving them people enough direction so that you help them, but holding back enough so that they grow and make their own mistakes. That's always the hardest part of parenting. Much of what that teaches you is directly transferable to being a good manager, to being a teacher, to being a mentor, to being a leader. So it's a work problem. It's a problem of not making room for care, for women and for men, for parents, but also people taking care of their parents or their spouse or extended family members. And frankly, self-care fits in there too. It isn't just about, and one of the interesting things about care is that you can invest in anything outside yourself, and that could be one of your passions. It's a couple's problem. So then the second point is, one of the things that we did when we had the second wave of the women's movement, we allowed women to have many more choices and to work the way men have always worked. But we devalue traditional women's work relative to traditional men's work. So that's an imbalance. And as I said, if you value care much more, that changes. But the other thing we've done is we've dramatically changed women's roles. We've barely changed men's roles at all. And I had this epiphany when I was looking at our sons, and I realized that if they were daughters, I'd be raising them completely differently than my mother was raised. Completely differently. My mother was told she shouldn't go to medical school. She would have been an awesome doctor, but her parents thought she was going to get married and have kids, so why invest? But I was raised differently, and certainly if I had daughters, I'd be raising them to do anything. And that anything would include being a mother and hopefully being a daughter and taking care of me and being, a whole human being. But when I look at my sons, I thought, I'm not raising them all that differently than my father was raised. I am raising them with the expectation, unless you really counteract it, that they will be breadwinners, that their role, their worth, their success in life is dictated by how well they do in their career. And that just can't be right. You cannot say that men and women are equal and that we have these two great drives in human nature and these two great functions that we engage in as individuals and as society. And women can be like men, but men still stay exactly where they were. It just can't be. So the second proposition is that women won't be equal until men are equal too. And that in many ways, men are really missing out. And I got this because men wrote to me and said, you think I have it all, but I would much rather spend more time with my family. I would love to have a different mix, but I have to be the breadwinner. This is my role, and I don't have any choice about it. And I can't decide to, work part-time and be with my kids. That's just not an option. Well, when things go well and you're a working woman with a family you love and you love your work and you love your family, you think it just doesn't get any better. Well, men should have that option too. Men should be able to be the primary caregiver or the lead parent, however you want to call it, or an equal co-parent. There's so many different ways you can do this, just the same way as women do. And there are two reasons. One, as I said, men ought to be able to have that kind of flexibility just as women do. It's a great thing. For all that we complain about, raising kids, it's a pretty wonderful thing. But equally, only if men can do that will they be able to support women in the very biggest jobs, right? Because no one has ever looked at the Fortune 500 men and said, he's the primary caregiver. Now, that just doesn't happen. Nobody would think that a male CEO could also be the person who goes to the parent-teacher conference, or who is there when your kid realizes he has a project at 6 p.m. the night before it's due, and you have to go and get all the supplies and help him and all of that. So you're going to have men supporting women the same way women support men. And when you talk to women CEOs, well over half, but we don't talk about this, so we don't get good numbers, but well over half have lead parent husbands, flexible husbands, some who are full-time at home and some who are doing consulting or something that allows them to be very flexible. So that's the second proposition, that we have to revalue care and we actually have to expand choices and roles for men. And that only if we do those two things, and you notice neither of those focuses specifically on women, will we be able to help all women, and will we actually get to real equality. So let me close just by talking about some of the more concrete solutions, because I'm an academic, I've reframed it, I've shifted the paradigm, I've done all those good things that academics do. But this is a very concrete book. In the last 4 chapters, I talk about how we talk, how we think and how we talk, right? Because I'm old enough to remember when we went from Miss and Mrs. to Ms. And lots of people said, oh, this is so silly. And I lived in Virginia, we said Ms. anyhow, but people thought it was a silly grammatical thing. But of course it made a huge difference, because Miss and Mrs. immediately communicated that a woman's most important job was to be married. That what you needed to know about her was she married or was she not? And when we went to Ms., just like Mr., nobody could tell. And that made a big difference. So how we talk matters. And right now we talk in a way that reinforces the idea that it is women's responsibility to raise children. So as you can hear, I don't talk about stay-at-home moms or dads. I think that assumes that a normal state is in the office, and so if you're not in the office, you need an adjective to say that you're at home. I much prefer the idea of lead parent or the anchor parent, or if you want the available parent, but it is taking the lead in an equally important job. That's the way I think about it, or caring for your own parents. I think we should be talking about working fathers. Right? We always talk about working mothers, and again, we seem to need to have an adjective to describe the fact that they're mothers and they're working. Well, all men who have kids are working fathers, and that immediately says they have 2 jobs, not just one. And the last one, and there are many others in the book, but the other one I would mention here is, on the flip side of it, we should stop talking about getting our husbands to help. Right? No more help. Help is when you make the list and he does the things you want him to do on that list and you make sure he's done them. That is actually, as a manager, that's a lot of work. But it's also, it again assumes you're in charge. And really getting to equality, and this is I hope this is what women will read and hand to their husbands or partners and say, read this. But when the men in this audience do read it, there's this one chapter where you'll hand it back to your wife and say, see, because there's one chapter about women's sexism and how hard it is for us to really let go at home, and how we basically do assume we know what is to be done and we know better. And the example I give is that if you as a woman walked into your office and your boss said, I'm biologically better at this, but I think you can do it if I micromanage you enough, you would sue him. But that is more or less the way many women, I will not say most, I will certainly include myself, treat our husbands. And my husband said, I am happy to do this, but I'm doing it my way. I'm organizing the kitchen my way, I am disciplining the kids my way, I'm determining what I think is the most important things that they should do my way, and if you want to do it, that's great, then come home and do it. But, and I had to realize that I thought I knew best because I was raised by my mother. So I just assumed, mothers know how to do this. There is no manual, right? Actually, and there are plenty of single dads who've raised wonderful kids. So that's another thing I think we should abolish, the idea of help. We should talk about co-parenting and let men be in charge as much as women are. It's not always smooth, but it is equal. Then I would talk, sort of turning then to how you think about your careers and how you, I don't know how you choose a mate. I'm not in the mate choosing business, but the conversation you need to have with your prospective mate. One thing that I think is very helpful is to think about our careers in terms of intervals. If you're an athlete, you know you go really hard and then you slow down, and you go really hard again, and you slow down. And we can think about careers in the same way. For one thing, young people will have many different jobs, and they're going to work and live for a long time. And there is plenty of time, if you think about it this way, and if the workplace thinks about it this way, to have periods where you go very intensively, and then periods where you don't take a promotion, where you move laterally, or you get a different set of skills, because you're focused more on caregiving. When your kids are young, when they're teenagers, when your parents are aging, different phases for different people. But there's no reason that you can't plan your career that way, and your workplace can't say when you're ready, you're still eligible for leadership positions. It is much more a function of when you choose rather than this kind of up or out. You know, if you didn't take that promotion, you're done. You won't be considered again. And similarly, when young couples are talking and they're thinking about how they're both going to have careers, they shouldn't just ask the question, will you support me? Because the answer to that is always yes. You need to ask questions like, if I get a promotion, will you move for me? If I get a promotion, will you defer yours? Because that's what it really takes to support somebody else's career. And as my husband wrote an article called Why I Put My Wife's Career First. And as he says, you know, jobs don't often follow the perfect rhythm. You know, you don't kind of get 5 years, he gets a promotion, 5 years you do. So you're really gonna have to think about these things. And you may not have answers to those questions, but you've gotta ask them early on. In the workplace, since I'm in California, I don't feel at all constrained about saying this. We essentially have to reinvent the workplace, and we are reinventing the workplace, partly just through the digital economy, but partly in the next 10 years, where we work and how we work is changing so deeply. And when we really get to full digital manufacturing, which is at least 10 years away, the workplace is going to look as different as it did when we moved from cottage industry to into the Industrial Revolution. And we're still living basically in Industrial Revolution workplaces, factories that we go to, offices that we go to. So we're heading for major change. In the shorter run, I think the way to do it is there's an organization called Open Work, like OpenGov or Open Source or Open Data, that is collecting all the ways that companies are in fact really changing their work practices. And they're companies from airlines to energy companies to construction companies to telemarketing. And there are lots of different ways. I think we are likely to do it in lots of different ways, but I have lots of suggestions about how you get your boss to agree to try on to some of those ways. And finally, this is not something we can do alone. I mean, this is not something we can do one CEO at a time, one woman at a time, one company at a time. Part of this has to be done politically and collectively. And as much as I love the self-help tradition, it's just not up to us individually. We as a country have to have politically mandated paid leave. It's absolutely essential, and it is coming. It is coming city by city. I live in New Jersey. We have paid leave. It's on a payroll tax. Cincinnati just joined over the weekend. Washington, D.C. today or yesterday put forward a 16-week paid leave plan. It is coming, but ultimately it's going to have to come at the state and federal level, because otherwise companies that are doing the right thing do get undercut by companies that don't. It's just like when we had to have an 8-hour working day. There were good companies 100 years ago that let people work 8 to 10 hours, but there were others that required them to work 16. So federal government has to do that. It has to require paid maternity and paternity leave. We're not going to be Britain and have a year. We're not going to be Romania and have 3 years. I mean, we're going to do it, yes, 3 years. Women don't get hired a lot.
What's the GDP of Romania?
Not very high, right? That's why I'm saying it's not I'm not remotely suggesting that. But 6 weeks we can probably do, and already, at least in the Equal Employment and Opportunity Commission, requires that you have equal paternity leave as you do maternity leave, except for the time to actually recover from the birth, which obviously is still distinctly female. And we need quality childcare. I mean, we were in 1971. both houses of Congress with a bipartisan majority passed universal child care. Right? It seems extraordinary, and Richard Nixon vetoed it. But you know, if we can be there in 1971, we can be there again. It's also a huge market, right? And it's got to be quality child care. We now know that the first 5 years of a kid's life, you are not just teaching that child things, you're shaping the kid's brain in a way that determines what he or she will learn for the rest of her life. We have the neuroscientific evidence, we have the empirical evidence, so there is an enormous market there of high quality early education. Right? It's not daycare, as if you're taking care of a property. It's investing in children's lifelong potential. So those are three areas at least, and I have a lot more in the book where I do think we need political action. As I said, I think it's coming. I think it's a middle class issue, not just a women's issue. You've got both parents working. Hillary Clinton has made this one of her 4 fights and feels passionately about it. But Marco Rubio also put out a plan just last week, right, for paid leave and how he would think about it. And there are going to be different ways of doing this, Republican and Democrat. That's fine, right? Well, this is both and. We need as many different approaches as we can, but we do have to act politically. So let me end just by saying, some of you may be thinking, I am a professor, or I was for a long time, and professors reimagine the world. That's what we get paid to do, but we also are accused of living in ivory towers and having no contact with the real world. I am actually optimistic that these changes are coming. I'm optimistic because of demographics, because millennials want to work very differently and they have different views of gender roles. But also, frankly, because elders can't afford to retire, and they are going to need to work differently. They're not going to work full-time, but a lot of them are going to have to stay in the workforce because they can't afford to retire. So you've got the young people and old people pushing for the same kind of changes that parents need. That's a real plus. I also think, as I said, politically, we're electing women, and we need to elect lots more of them. And it isn't just because we should only have women, I don't believe that at all, but men actually behave differently once you get a critical mass of women. And there's very good research politically on how once you get a critical mass of women, then you get different choices. And I think that's also where we're heading. But the real reason in the end that I'm optimistic is just how much change I've seen in my lifetime. Right? When I was growing up, my mother used to set out little vases of cigarettes at dinner parties, right? Because everybody smoked, and that was what you did as a good hostess. Not so much now, right? When I was growing up, effectively, we still had Jim Crow in large parts of the South, where I was, not completely, but there was still de facto complete segregation. The idea of an African-American president was just impossible. And, I didn't know a single woman lawyer or judge or engineer or professor. That's not true. I knew one woman lawyer, but I'd never seen a doctor or a woman in any other position. And yet, in 2012, when my 14-year-old and I were watching John Kerry give a speech at the Democratic Convention, my son said, well, who is that? And I said, well, that's John Kerry, and if Obama wins again, he'll probably be Secretary of State. And Alexander said, without missing a beat, you mean a man can be Secretary of State? And he totally meant it. He knew Hillary Clinton, he knew Condi Rice, and Colin Powell had been when he was 5 years old. So, that's a lot of progress. And the last thing I will say is even 5 years ago, we wouldn't have believed that we would have same-sex marriage the way we do now. The idea that the Supreme Court would have upheld it and that states after state would have and made it possible that the New York Times would be, and whatever your newspaper is, would be listing, same-sex weddings alongside heterosexual weddings. That's an enormous cultural revolution. So if we can do all of that, then valuing care in the same way that we value the competitive side of our nature, and opening choices to men that we are now opening to women just doesn't seem that much of a stretch. It seems like finishing the business of the women's movement. Thank you very much.